Okay, everybody, we have, I don't want to call it a mixed bag in Naso, because what I hope we can do, I know we won't finish it tonight, but by the time we finish tomorrow, I hope that there'll be something you're seeing that's running through all these seemingly disjointed topics in Naso, because just to scan through it, we have a census, basically of Levitical clans, the counting, the numbering, the counted ones. A strange little insertion there concerning leprosy and people who have become impure through emission or through contact with a corpse, that they need to go outside the camp, which is kind of strange in the context, but maybe it's not. A person who commits a trespass and how they're supposed to add a fifth to the principal value. Again, seems a little odd in context, but maybe not. And then a section that's usually referred to as the trial of the sotah. The trial of the sotah. And I know I've mentioned it before, and if you didn't know exactly what I was talking about when I said the trial of the sotah, this tour portion summarizes what you should do if a husband suspects his wife of adultery, if she has been secluded with another man after he has warned her not to be, that if he's jealous and he wants to clear up the doubt, then they go into the tabernacle and they perform this ritual of the bitter water. And in the ritual of the bitter water, it'll be revealed whether she is guilty or whether she is innocent. And of course, the sign of her innocence is she's going to bear fruit. And then following right on the heels, the trial of the sotah, which has very specific instructions, by the way, in terms of the meal offering that she brings and the pronunciation of the curses and what the woman has to say, and the progression of the wasting away of the belly and thigh. And in previous years, we've tied that back to the snake, how he falls down and goes on his belly, how that's connected to Babylon the Great, has fallen because of the doubling of the curse and the Amen, Amen. John eating the little scroll, it's sweet in his mouth, but then when it gets into his belly, it's bitter and so forth. So we're not going to revisit that aspect of the trial of the sotah. This year, I'm going to take the trial of the sotah and connect it to everything around it. So what seems to be disjointed, we'll see it really has a joint that's holding it together. Because right on the heels of the trial of the sotah, what we have is the Nazarite Vow, which is kind of a curious section. And it has specifically to do with being set apart from grapes, any sort of grape product, even I don't guess you could even fry with grapeseed oil if you had taken a Nazarite vow. Again, it seems disjointed, but I don't think it is. But there are extensive laws of the Nazir, or the Nazarite. And then we have the priestly blessing. Again, I don't think it's out of context. It only appears to be. And then it ends up with a very specific counting and description of what the 12 princes of Israel brought for the service of the tabernacle for the Levites to use in the service. And again, I think it's all going to tie together in a specific way. And then the last thing, in chapter 7, verse 89, it says, when Moses arrived at the tent of meeting to speak with him, he heard the voice communicating with him from atop the cover that was upon the ark of the testimony, from between the two cherubim, and he spoke to him. So we have a little allusion here at the very end of the parasha of Naso, again taking us back to the garden. What was between the two cherubim and the garden? The entrance to the garden. And so that's going to explain some things. And I didn't have time to chase down Hebron as it relates to this portion and the prophets, but if I have time before tomorrow, I'll try to chase that down for you, because I saw the connection there between the cutting of the hair at Hebron and so forth, because we know that Absalom, Avshalom, he had long hair that he had to cut every year. And so the hair and the head keep popping up in these Torah portions. So let me go ahead. That's just a survey of pretty much everything in the portion. Now it's our job to figure out how all that fits together. And I'm not sure I'll do a great job at it, because it's hard to immerse yourself in something and then back far enough away from it that you can help somebody else look at it who might just be looking at it for the first time in a year. You know, it might have been since last year that you looked at the Torah portion. So once you get in that forest, it is hard to see the forest for the trees, but we're going to do our best to pull up some of these commonalities. That is wrong. I don't want that. That is right. I do want that. Okay, so there's our passages, and we are going to look at the Psalm this week because it's so relevant and so helpful, I think, in helping us pull out that common thread that's going to run through all the little topics within the Torah portion. And eventually what I hope you see is it really is possible to go around with your hair on fire. But it might be a while before we reach that conclusion. So let's go to Numbers 447, where we start out. And I just want to pull out this verse here so that you can see an anomaly within the text. I want to start with this anomaly because within this textual anomaly, we have a word. And some form of that word is going to continually pop up in the portion. And maybe it's that particular word that's going to help us figure out what all these individual things have in common. So in English, we would read, which you remember the last portion, because we're numbering warriors from the tribe, it's like from 20 years old and upward. Okay, now we're starting with the Levites, and we're counting from 30 years and upward, even to 50 years old. So the Levite has a window of 20 years when he's considered fit for service. And you have to remember, if you've ever seen an animal slaughtered, it's a tremendous amount of work to do it. You know, even if you're a hunter and you don't have to do all the, you know, basically the preparatory work of kosher slaughter, there's a lot of pre-work that goes into a kosher slaughter. Especially as we're talking about tabernacle service, where everything has to be perfect. But even from the, you know, the point of dressing out a dead animal, there's a lot of work, and it's heavy lifting. It's literally heavy lifting. So it wasn't for the old men. They could still serve in different ways. But as far as doing that heavy lifting work, the preparatory work, the setting up of the tabernacle, the taking down of the tabernacle, the carrying of the objects and so forth, it was very hard physical labor. So they had that window of 20 years there where they could work. And incidentally, the Hebrew letter kaf has a value of 20, and kaf is also going to be a two-letter root that you're going to see in the Torah portion in some significant places. And so it says from 30 years and upward, even to 50 years old. Everyone who could enter to do the work of service and the work of carrying in the tent of meeting. So I've got highlighted in Hebrew, if you can read it, or at least follow the letters, the Hebrew letters, that one root word that's going to keep popping up throughout the portion is ma'al, which would be mem, ein, lamed. And you see that in the first line there. So in context, it's v'ma'elah. And so keep your eyes tuned or your ears tuned to hear some representation in other contexts of either ma'al, me'il, or al. Just taking the two letters out of it. It may not have the mem in it. Because remember, you already know one aspect of this word, which is olah. And olah means to go up. When we say al, we mean on. It's like a preposition, on. So the words are related. So ma'al, and that's going to be and upward. So you can hear kind of when we say olah, like a going up offering, an ascending offering, this using it in context as upward, from 30 years old and upward. And then the doubles here. I want to look at these doubles. So we've got la'avod, avodat, avodah, avodat. So even if you don't speak Hebrew, or even if you don't read Hebrew, if you were to hear those doubles, basically, you may not understand that that's doubled grammar, but you will hear that the Hebrew word for service is coming 1, 2, 3, 4 in context. So we want to look at that too. What is this service that it's talking about, and why is this such an odd turn of phrase? Could this not have been said in a much simpler way? Well, there's a reason it's not said in a much simpler way, because it has a dual meaning. And therefore, when you see a doubled word in Hebrew, you pay attention. And sometimes that's as simple as they're giving you a verb form and a noun form. And that's kind of what you're seeing here, but you're seeing it doubled. Okay, so when we say the work of service, it's the same root, oved. So we can use it as a verb, and we can use it as a noun, like avodat is a noun construct, right? La'avod is the verb. So let's see. Let's look at an art scroll here. It says, everyone who comes to perform service of a service. You see how they kind of went with a more literal English rendering from that? The first translation in English there is from the NASB. So they're actually kind of trying to translate it out of there. The art scroll doesn't mind if it doesn't exactly make sense. So they're translating everyone who comes to perform service of a service and the work of carrying the tent of meeting. So there's no problem here with this double meaning. So it says service of a service and the work of carrying the tent of meeting. So there's two kinds of service. There's a service of a service, and we're going to figure out what that is. But there is also the work that we more literally read into the portion, that it's talking about the Levites carrying the articles of the tent of meeting, carrying that burden. They have to carry that burden through the wilderness. It has to become a portable center point. has to be able to move. And so there's that service, but there's also something they're calling a service of a service. And so what this is seen as is singers. It's a song. And that's how it's described when it says avodat avodah, the service of a service. The commentary, and this is coming from Rashi, is that it's the song that's performed with cymbals and harps. In other words, it's a service done for another service, the carrying and the serving in the tent. In other words, there were Levites whose service was to sing and play music while the work was being done, while the service was being done. So simultaneously, there's two types of service, which explains why you're going to see the double-double. So you didn't just have to, let's say, break down the boards in the fencing around the tabernacle. You would take down those boards to the accompaniment of Levites who were singing and who were playing cymbals and harps. So it's not typical, probably, of a construction or deconstruction project. It would be interesting. Today we've got new neighbors and they're building a house next door and we hear a lot of hammering. And I was thinking today, what if they had a whole bunch of Levites standing around singing and playing cymbals and harps while they worked on putting that house up? But I guess it was maybe an ancient form of earbuds or something. But there's a service of a service. And so in this, we have seeds. Remember, the Torah is the prophecy and the prophets are its legs. So if you're going to see a Levitical singing cadre somewhere else in Scripture, and you do, you say, well, where is the seed of that? As we go back, we can come right here to this seed, and we can see even in the wilderness, there was singing and there was music, some form of music, that would accompany the service of the Mishkan. Therefore, when the Mikdash, the temple, comes along, then it makes sense that there would be Levitical musicians and singers who would perform the service of a service. Anything done in those holy places would be done to the accompaniment of music, song, and instruments. In fact, if you look in the Psalms, it'll often tell you what type of instrument that particular song is designed for. If it's designed for a specific type of harp, as the star player, I don't know what you call the instrument that's featured in an orchestra, but it'll feature that particular type of instrument very specifically. So later, we're going to see song is important in other places. If we look in Ezra, where the people are returning from Babylon, they're returning from exile, there's an extensive numbering, which kind of echoes what's going on in this Torah portion. And as you get toward the end of that second chapter of Ezra, it comes up with this strange comment about singing men and women. It says they had 200, following where it goes through who's coming back, and then it's got the Levites, it's got the priests and those numbers, and then it throws this in there, 200 singing men and women. And you say, well, now wait a minute, who are these 200 singing men and women? Well, the song has always been an important part of worship in Israel. In this case, 200 singing men and women. And then we can go back to 2 Chronicles 35:25. And it hints to maybe what their job was. not only did you have Levites singing for the service, and as they served, we also had singers who were important parts of other times in life. They had other functions. It says Jeremiah lamented for Yoshiyahu. Remember, Yoshiyahu was a good king. Made a mistake there at the end, like we all do. Fortunately, we don't all die the first time we make a mistake. But it says that Yirmiyahu lamented for Yoshiyahu, and all the singing men and the singing women spoke of Yoshiyahu in their lamentations to this day, and made them an ordinance in Israel. And behold, they are written in the Lamentations. So there's a hint here. Sometimes you had, well, that was actually, they would hire mourners for funerals sometimes, if there weren't enough people to mourn, I guess. But part of the function of mourning was that you had pretty much professional singers, and which my aunt and uncle did that for years and years. The funeral home hired them to come in and sing when the family didn't know any singers. So that's how they put my cousin through college. At any rate, they were professional singers for a funeral. But we can see that they were actually part of an ordinance in Israel. Whatever these men and women were singing, it says it's actually written in the Lamentations, and we have a book of Lamentations. So we know that the singers preserved scripture in song. They sang it for mourning. They preserved history. When they're speaking of Yoshiyahu, they're obviously singing of the good things that he did during his reign. But we also see that there's a reference here that it was their job to preserve scripture in song. So let's look at chapter 4, verse 47. I don't know if that's the right reference or not. Maybe it is. It says, he counted them at the word of Hashem, and I'm still looking at the art scroll right here. He counted them at the word of Hashem through Moshe. And that's why I wanted you to see the art scroll. Now I remember why I did this. I wanted you to see how art scroll translates it as opposed to a typical Christian translator. Because the art scroll is staying very true to the Hebrew text. It's not trying to explain it so much for an English reader. It's trying to translate what is written, and there's a difference. And you find that out when you have to translate things for people. There's a difference between staying true to what was actually said and then trying to explain it in words that the person will understand, at the cost of taking out the literal meaning of what was said. So in the art scroll, I put in capital letters so you could notice, and then I also highlighted it in the Hebrew so you could notice, because I wanted you to see again that root word that we're looking for, which is al or ma'al, which means over. Or in the first instance that we saw it, it meant upward. In any case, over this number. And now it's being put in the context of the work and the burden. So we're talking about the Levites here. It says every man over his work and over his burden. And there's two separate words there, and we're going to see that word again. Avodato, his work. So he's on his work. Ve'al masa'o. Okay, masa is a burden or a work. When you read in the prophets, sometimes if it translates things literally, it'll say, and the prophet so-and-so picked up his burden. All right, that would be ma'aso. Okay. The masa is the actual burden. So when a prophet gives a prophecy, it's because he's carrying this burden. And then he has to discharge that burden. But remember, there's a strange saying, and I forget where it is in the Greek, but it says the spirits of the prophets are subject to the prophets. In other words, there's a discipline that has to be exercised in prophecy. And you can see that discipline in the wording of this passage, because it says, Ve'al masa'o, Ve'al masa'o, on, over the burden. In other words, the Levite has to be over his work, over his burden. He has to have a discipline. He has to be in charge. He has to have authority and skill in that work and in that burden. If you don't know what you're doing, don't prophesy. All right, if you want to extend that principle, the Levites had to learn, and they had to be very skilled in what they did. So we have that preposition there, al, which means on or over. You have to be in control of your burden. You have to be in control of your service to Hashem. Now, that's a pattern and a principle we can say right now. All right, what is my burden? We all have a burden, and you know what it is. You know what it is that the Father has asked you to carry through this life. You know what your service is that the Father has asked you to carry through this life. The only question is, are you functioning in that burden and in that service over it? In other words, is it under your control? Spirit of the prophets are subject to the prophets, right? The work doesn't rule you. You rule over the work. Because if the work rules over you, then it will descend into a level of chaos. That's important to understand. So even in English, we kind of have an expression. If your boss says, okay, I need you to go do such and such, you'll say, okay, boss, I'm on it. It even comes into English. We understand that work is something to be on. So yes, you carry the burden, but at the very same time, you're on the burden. You work the work, yet at the very same time, you're on the work, right? And so there at the bottom of the slide, I kind of isolated those two words, avodato and masa'o, so that you could see on both of those, whether we're talking about the burden or the work, which is the service, it's something that you have to be on top of. You have to be on it. Which, in a common sense explanation, if you're on the work, it means you've not abandoned the work. When you've abandoned the work, there's no way you can be on it. But it's in our work and in our burdens and in our service that we are tempted to betray. And that's going to be that root word. That's why I want to look at it, ma'al. Like you hear al in ma'al. And then I also wanted you to listen for me'il, the context where you hear the word me'il, because the robe of the high priest is called the me'il. It's going to come from the same Hebrew root. So when you're not on your work or your burden, then confusion is going to enter in. That's why it was so important for the Levites to know what they were doing and then to be equipped for what they were doing. And so then you see the tribes bringing them the equipment and the supplies that they will need in order to be on the work. in order to be on the burden. Because if they're on the work and the burden, then they're carrying the burden. They're doing the work. They're working the work and they're carrying the burden, right? But in order to do that work, they have to be on it. When those things are happening, then there's no confusion as to what you're supposed to be doing. And if you're sitting there saying, well, you know what, I go through these long spells where I'm not really sure if I am doing what I'm supposed to be doing. That's okay. That's part of where we are. Moses had a long time to teach the Levites so that they would not be confused about what they were doing. So when we do have confusion, it's okay to, step back and reposition and wait for the cool of the evening. Never make a decision in the heat of the day that will wait until the cool of the evening. Because if you work when you're confused, then the work is worse at the end of the day than if you had stopped and done nothing else. And I'm just speaking from the context of the garden. Had Adam and Eve stopped what they were doing and waited when they became confused about the word, when the serpent confused them, when they weren't sure, when they knew that it's possible that this guy is selling me exactly what I'd like to buy. And that's what the soul does. The words of the serpent appeal to the soul, your appetite, emotion, desire, and intellect. When you feel you're being tugged in those directions, it's fine just to stop, walk away, and get clarity from the word itself. Because, if you've ever worked in an area where people get lost in the woods or in the desert, the important thing is for them to quit walking. Because the farther they walk, typically they're not walking in the direction they think they're walking, unless they have some pretty good survival skills. Often they will be going in circles or they'll be going in exactly the wrong direction. It's important, unless you know how to follow a stream bed, to a bigger stream, to a river, here in the hills of Kentucky, that's basically all you would need to do is find a stream, follow it, you'll get a bigger stream, follow it, you'll get a bigger stream, and eventually you'll get to a river and a bridge and you'll be in civilization. But if you don't have that skill, the best thing you can do is stop and stand still, and people will come find you. But typically what we do in confusion is think, well, if I just walk right over that hill, if I just do something, I can fix it. Well, if you're in a state of confusion, you probably got a 50-50 shot, maybe less, at straightening it out. You do have to go back to the word. And that's why, it seems like it's forever when you're waiting on an answer. But it's better to wait for the answer, to pray for the answer, and to sing for the answer than to start walking in confusion. And in terms of the song, why would the Levites sing songs? Why would they play music? Why would they play on instruments to accompany the work? Well, if you'll remember, the Torah itself is a song. It's always sung in the synagogues. It's not read. The reading is a song. So the song of creation begins with Genesis 1:1. So after Sukkot, when you start a new cycle of reading in the Torah, you begin the song anew. You start singing the song of creation. That's how the reading starts. And in the first song that you sing on Shabbat, you realize that creation was orderly. There wasn't any confusion. It was numbered, just like the portion we're reading. And because it was orderly and because it was numbered, it was also fruitful. Everything that was happening in that song was happening within all those boundaries established. And so the establishment of creation was without confusion, and it was established in song. So in the same way, because this is what the Mishkan is doing, it's trying to take us back to the garden. It's encouraging us. Remember, it's a portal of hope. That's what we said last week. The entrance to the tabernacle was a portal of hope, that we could be resurrected, that a Redeemer was coming, that salvation was coming. So likewise, we've got this song of the Levites, the harps and the cymbals, and they're going to be established not just for the daily work of the Mishkan, but for the carrying it, for the setting it up, for the tearing it back down, to carry it again. What goes on in the tent has song. It's happening within the song, just like the song of creation. So, I forget what movie it was in. It's one of the cartoon movies, Disney probably, where it says, whistle while you work. That's not bad advice. Better advice is sing while you work and sing the song of Scripture. Sing the songs of creation. I know when I was growing up, I don't know where my mom learned to do it, but she could play the piano to almost any psalm. That's how I kind of learned psalms, because she had something, I think it was called a psalter. I don't know if you guys have ever heard of a psalter. I hope that's the right word, like Psalter. And she would just, and it was usually from King James, if I remember right, the English of it, but she could play almost any psalm to this music. And I don't know where she learned the music. But when she was going through something, and she was definitely a lady who had hard burdens to bear, she would go to the piano and she would sing psalms. And that eased the burden, and I think it reduced the confusion, because it doesn't just reduce confusion, it infuses you with truth. It infuses you with pure word that has no confusion in it. If you're singing a psalm, where's the confusion in that? It's not in the song itself. It's only in your interpretation of it, maybe. But the confusion itself will never be found in the word. And so that's what she was doing. To remove the confusion from her own life, she sang the psalms in which there is no confusion. So as these Levites are working their work, there are other Levites performing the service of the service, so that there's no confusion in this little representation of Eden. Whereas the serpent was allowed to introduce confusion at the beginning, they're saying, no, let's protect this little area. Let's guard this little area better, so that we're not allowing confusion to ever enter in. And our traditional psalm, and we'll look at it this week. I don't always look at the psalm during the lesson, but it's worth it, because I always try to put it on the PowerPoints so that you have a chance to look at it and see the connections, and probably find some new things that, if you're doing a Bible study, you could introduce to your students. But the traditional one is Psalm 67 for Naso, and it's going to fuse these songs of the strings, the Aaronic Benediction, which is also in the portion, and the earth's produce, of course, which is the people. And what we see in Psalm 67 is that those people will return to the song of creation in the Torah. And here's the psalm. This is for the choir director with stringed instruments. So it's giving you the feature instrument. This is something you want to play on strings. A psalm, a song. God be gracious to us and bless us, and cause his face to shine upon us. Selah. All right, there you have a passage from the Aaronic Benediction. And if you've ever heard the Aaronic Benediction, which I think you all have, and you might have heard different versions of it, but it's always sung. It's set to song. It's trying to fuse those of us in the natural realm to the spiritual realm, because that's where the word comes from. It comes from the spiritual realm. It says that your way may be known on the earth, your salvation, your Yeshua among all nations. Let the peoples praise you, O God. Let all the peoples praise you. Let the nations be glad and do what? Sing for joy. Well, what would they be singing? Well, they're probably not going to be singing a country song or a rock and roll song or a rap song, which I don't think rap is music, but maybe it is. They're going to sing for joy. So the song is found in the word itself. Let the nations be glad and sing for joy. So the song of creation, the Torah, you can see that it's being restored not just to Israel, it's also being restored to the nations. And it says they're glad and they're singing for joy. That's typically something you would associate with Sukkot, the Feast of Sukkot, the season of our joy. It says, for you will judge the peoples with uprightness and guide the nations on the earth. The help is coming. Why? Because he doesn't want us to be confused. The confusion in the garden got all the bad things started. Well, he's going to offer guidance, and he's always offered guidance through his word. But this will be a time when that guidance will proliferate. Selah, let all the peoples praise you, O God. Let all the peoples praise you. The earth has yielded its produce. God, our God, blesses us. God blesses us, that all the ends of the earth may fear him. Okay, so we've got, and I numbered so you could see the overlap there. 3 times the psalm uses the word bless, just like in the Aaronic Benediction. Did I put it on there? Yes, I did. This is from Numbers 6:22 through 27. Notice that it mentions the blessing 3 times. Speak to Aaron and to his sons, saying, thus you shall bless the sons of Israel. You shall say to them, the Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face shine upon you, be gracious to you. The Lord lift up his countenance on you and give you peace. So they shall invoke my name on the sons of Israel, and then I will bless them. So it's bless, bless, bless. We go back to 67, and what do we get? Not only do we get this insertion of the Aaronic Benediction, we get bless, bless, bless. And we know that 3 is the number of resurrection, because the 3rd day of creation is when the produce came forth, when the trees brought forth their fruit. So there is fruitfulness in the song. Do you see that? Why, if you knew the tune to this song, how that could remove confusion on a bad day. You know, sometimes if you've ever heard the Aaronic Benediction, just walking around the house, you might find yourself humming it or singing it. Why? Because it's touching you in spiritual realms. It's removing confusion in your life, even when you're just like, oh man, I get that thing stuck in my head. I don't know why. Well, if it's a song like this, what it's doing, it's removing confusion from your mind, and it's leaving that pure song of the creation there. If it's, I don't know, a line from Metallica that's stuck in your head, then what it's doing is it's leaving its imprint of chaos. It's doing the exact opposite. You have to discern the words. What is the source of the word? It's either going to be an upper source, the spirit above, or it's going to come from below. And what is below is going to try to get you below your burden, to fall under the burden. You see now it's important to be on top of the burden, to be on top of the work, because when you get under it, then you're subject, you're vulnerable to those forces from below. So that's why we have to be pretty careful. The sort of music that we listen to, it's introducing words, and sometimes you need to go through your playlist and do some weeding out. I do every now and then because stuff will creep in there. I had to do that with my photos last night. Just go through like, why do I have 16 copies of this? But we need to do that with our music too. We need to go through our music and make sure that what we're introducing ourselves to, not just introducing, but is this song that I'm listening to or this song that I'm singing, is it keeping me on top of my work? Or is it weighing me down? Is it introducing confusion? Is the message in this song contrary to the message of what's in this song of creation, the song of Moses? Okay, moving forward, you remember this from last year, and this is not supposed to be like to scale completely right. It's just a representation to help you remember the camps of the Levites and the four degalim, the banners with the lion and the eagle and the man and the bull. But last year we spent some time looking at how those Levites camped, so we could see like that process of restoration. Because in the Psalm, in Psalm 67, it talks about nations and peoples. Well, the camp of Gershon, which, let's see. That is not the opening verse, but it's the second one, which there were no verses. So in the opening statement, Hashem spoke to Moses saying, take a census of the sons of Gershon. Right? So it's not that the other clans are not important, but we can see he's opening with the clan of Gershon. So look to the left there where you see the head of the bull. And that's going to represent the Western clans of Gershon the Levite and the tribes of Joseph and Benjamin. And when we say Joseph, we mean Ephraim, Manasseh, and then added to that Benjamin. That's going to be the three sons of Rachel and Jacob. So they're all camped in the west. And traditionally, when people come, like the strangers, they're going to come from the west. And, you know, it talks about Joseph that, you know, he's going to take his horns and he's going to push the people to the ends of the earth. He's going to push them west. But then there's also a return of the ger, or the stranger, from the west. So the people who left that way, it looks like they'll also be coming back that way. But in itself, it can also represent any stranger, any ger. And so you get that clan of Gershon from the Levites camped on that side, representing how a stranger might find his way back. And I think it's significant that the sons of Joseph would be camped on that west side based on just the context of the rest of the Torah portion. So we've got Israel's Mishkan, the tabernacle, and the Mikdash, the temple. What can we tell in context? Was it supposed to be something just for Israel? Or was Solomon really clear when he dedicated the temple? Was Yeshua really clear when he cleansed the temple that it was to be a house of prayer for all nations? What Israel was doing in that Mishkan in the wilderness and what they were doing in that Mikdash is they were to be lights. They were to be that song in the darkness so that the peoples so that the earth could return to its first order. And its first order of creation was a song. Starting with Genesis 1:1, it was spoken and sung in a certain order. Right now, the earth is in chaos. The earth is in darkness. And so anytime we sing the song of the Torah, the song of Moses, the Psalms, the spiritual songs that are contained in the Word, then we are restoring light and the darkness, and we are helping to return the earth back to that order of the original song. And song really is the mystery of the Word. It's the Spirit that's moving those things which are spiritual into the natural realm, and then from the natural realm to the spiritual. Remember, Eden was a fusion of spiritual and natural realms. We get that picture from watching what Yeshua did. And so it's the song that bridges the gap. That's why I put that section in workbook 6 on the function of the Galilee, the Kinneret. The Galilee is a harp, to show you how the song blows down from those 4 headwaters into the Galilee, into the harp, and then from the harp, the song or the water flows all the way down to the bottom of Israel. It flows through the whole nation. So song is what's bridging that gap between the natural and the spiritual. The point of singing songs of salvation, singing songs of deliverance, singing songs of redemption, singing the song of creation, singing these songs to accompany the service in the Mishkan, is to bring humankind back to its center, to bring it back to that fruitful garden. And that's what the psalm says. The earth will yield its produce. It's the job of Israel to work in those vineyards and produce after their own kind. Human beings who know how to function in both the spiritual and the natural, the created realms. And the only way that's going to happen is through the resurrection of Yeshua. And, we see King David as a type of Messiah. He was called the sweet singer of Israel. And we can see that in Yeshua too. In workbook 6, I break down some of the words so that you can see the reason Yeshua was called a Notzri, not a Nazir, like in our Torah portion, but a Notzri, was most likely because he was singing his sermons. When you go into the synagogue, what do? You sing the prophets, you sing the Torah, you sing the Psalms. So when Yeshua gave his messages, he may have actually sang songs, or it may have come across in more of a chant like we do when we hear the Torah. Over time, if you listen to it long enough, you'll hear the same notes and how things are sustained. You say, well, okay, once you figure out the system, then you can do it. So it's more of a chant than an actual song. But then on the other hand, it is a song because you're singing. A chant is a song. So you say, well, that's all very, nice and beautiful to think about the Torah as a song and a restoration back to the creation. But look at all this other stuff in the Torah portion. We've got, some ugly stuff going on here. We've got a woman accused of adultery. We've got a Nazarite who has to start all over from scratch if he gets close to a corpse, which specifically if he's in a tent and he contracts tameh from a corpse in a tent, because a Nazir is naturally going to stay away from a corpse, from a dead body. But if accidentally, unexpectedly, somebody were to pass away in a tent in which he is in the tent, then because he's in the tent, he will contract the uncleanness, and then he has to start his vow all over again. But like I said at the beginning, is it possible all these things have something in common? We looked at a possibility, or maybe just made a reference to it back when we were talking about the Metzora, the leper. And what Joseph did, we know that he had a tattletale mouth, which could have brought on a leprosy, but it didn't. However, it did bring about consequences. He was separated from the camp, and after his imprisonment, at the time of his restoration, being brought to Pharaoh's court, it says that he did shave his whole body, which is what a leper would do. And if you remember, we had that strange little chapter 5, verse 2. Command the children of Israel that they shall send away from the camp everyone with tzarat, leprosy, everyone who's had an emission, and everyone impure by a corpse. Male and female alike, you shall send away to the outside of the camp. So Joseph was sent away, but then at the time of his restoration, just like a leper, once he's declared clean, he had to shave all his body hair to present himself to the priest. And he does that. And remember the imprisonment, we say, well, how does all this fit together? Well, it's interesting because his imprisonment was because he was suspected of adultery. Well, right before you get to the laws of the Nazir, we get the instructions for a woman suspected of adultery. And remember, Joseph's children camped on the west side of the tabernacle. And the Benjamite tribe, the males were nearly wiped out at one point because of sexual perversion. You've got, Joseph and Benjamin being full brothers. There was probably a very good reason that Joseph needed this virtual state of a Nazir, being separated from his brothers, and it mentions that in his blessing. Sometimes when we read the English translation, we don't really get the idea. We get more of the idea like he was set above his brother, but the Nazir, it's going to be more like separated, set apart from his brothers. So there's a couple of different things going on here. And as I said, we want to look for the commonality. What's holding all this stuff together in terms of a lesson that we could learn? I think basically Joseph, after that incident with Potiphar's wife, he's held up as iconic of somebody who overcomes that strong urge for sexual transgression, right, as being holy and being pure. But the rabbis also point out that in connecting it with the trial of the Sotah, specifically with the woman, it uses specific language. Here it is. Chapter 5, verse 12. Any man, if his wife will go astray and commit a trespass against him, and a man will have lain with her carnally, but it was hidden from the eyes of her husband, and she became secluded, and she was defiled. So what is this thing turning on? The suspicion is there because she was secluded with another man. In other words, a male and a female were isolated and nobody else could see inside. No, there's no other witnesses. And to this day, when you're talking about Orthodox Judaism and common practice, a male and a female who are not family members are never alone. They'll crack a door, They'll open a window. They make sure that anybody who's walking by can see exactly what's going on so that they're not completely alone. Because when you're completely alone with a person of the opposite sex, with no witnesses, that's where suspicion enters in. It's from the seclusion that the suspicion comes. And in this case, he actually warned her. I don't know where it was. Verse 14, a spirit of jealousy had passed over him, and he had warned his wife. So he had warned her not to be alone with this guy, and then she's been alone with him. And that's where the spirit of suspicion and jealousy enters in. It's because of the seclusion. So that's what happened to Joseph. He got secluded. He allowed himself to be secluded with Potiphar's wife. Now, Joseph's over everything. So Joseph should have known that there weren't any people in the house at that time. He should have made sure, if he's over everything, he can tell this servant, come with me. Right? And that's just smart practice. When you get in situations like that, if you're a teacher, if you're a congregational leader, or you're the leader of your fellowship, and you need to talk to someone of the opposite sex, have somebody there with you. Have a third party. Don't do the one-on-one, male and female. Don't ever seclude yourself with a member of the opposite sex. Even doctors' offices have figured this out, because in the last several years I've gone to a doctor. Even if it's a female now, there will be a medical assistant in there with her, but especially if there's a male, there's always another female assistant in there, just to make sure, because you're secluded and the person could say anything happened, or it might be the other way around. Nevertheless, don't allow yourself to become secluded, because that's where doubt enters in, and that's also where temptation enters in. And that's going to be something that's going to connect Joseph with the Nazir. Not only is he called a Nazir, one who's set apart from his brothers, but he has the temptation of the sotah, of the seclusion with someone of the opposite sex. And here's what we get: the trial of the sotah. So here we say, okay, there's jealousy is entered in because something sexually inappropriate may have happened. Well, how do those things happen? Often they happen because we have altered ourselves, our logic, our reason, our ability to think through a problem. We've altered it with alcohol, or in today's terms, also with drugs. So what is the very next thing we find out? And it's using a male and a female example here. It's using the sotah in the case of the female. But we understand when we read the trial of the sotah that at the very same time the judgment falls on her, it happens to her partner. He is not excluded. It happens to him too. It's going to be the same thing with the Nazir. It'll say it can be a man or woman can do it, can take on the vow of the Nazir, but it's going to use the male as the example. So over here it's going to use the female. With the Nazir, it's going to use the male. So you can see how Joseph is fusing these two ideas together. Yes, he's consecrated, but he didn't use good sense. All right. And so often the rabbis say a Nazir is somebody who needs better sense. They need to get control of appetite, emotion, desire, and intellect. They need to get better control of their soul because they want to be consecrated for a holy purpose, not because they're defective. We're all defective. But if you want to serve at higher, if you want to be more on the job, if you want to be more on the burden, then you're going to have to up your game, pardon the pun, in terms of the things of righteousness and holiness. So if you say, I'm struggling in this area and I don't think I can ever progress in my service until I really get a handle on this area, you may say, okay, I'm going to discipline my soul. I'm going to take on a Nazarite vow. And when you do that, what you are removing something out of your life that can alter your judgment, where you might walk in to a place of seclusion or into a place of temptation with someone of the opposite sex. Or even today, we have the ability to do that with pornography online, right? We can bring the person right into our home virtually if we push the right buttons. So we say, I want to get better control of my soul. So in this context, the example is, if you're going to be a Nazarite, you can't drink wine. You can't consume grape products in any form. I don't think you could even use grapeseed oil. The Nazir is not a Cohen. It's a lay person who wants to function at a higher level. Because see, if you're a Cohen, it's not because you're a special person. You're born into it. You're nothing special. All right, it's a matter of lineage. You can't be more of a Cohen than a Cohen unless you're just the high priest. All right, the high priest would be selected because of his merit. But other than that, you know, and there's one or two or a few in a generation. Other than that, a Cohen's just a Cohen. It's what he's born to. But the lay person can progress in holiness. The lay person can be more on the job. The lay person can do better at carrying the burden. They can prepare themselves for a type of priesthood. So if you want to ascend, to go up to those higher levels, and you say, you know what? I've got an aggressive Yetzer Hara, which is the evil inclination. Why? Because it's a soul that's in competition with the spirit. We're rowdy. All right? Your soul is very rowdy. It's a strong life force. And it likes to take control of the spirit. That means your appetites, your emotion, your desire, your intellect, it wants to control the spirit. But we know that the opposite is how it works. The spirit is supposed to take control of the soul. It's supposed to discipline it, which goes back to be on top of your job. Be on top of your burden. And so he says, I want to discipline my appetites. And it might be, you know, I want to discipline my physical appetite. It might be an appetite for wine, but it doesn't have to be. You know, whatever it is that you lust after, maybe it's gambling. Maybe it's just competition. I've known people who were just over the top. Everything was a competition to them. They had no ability to relate to anyone other than trying to beat them. Maybe your emotions are out of control, one way or the other. Maybe your intellect you can feel it taking over. And you know what? The more your intellect takes over, I think the more likely you are to disbelieve, to lose faith. So if you can recognize these things happening, then you say, I'm going to take this vow. And you've got a lot of choices in terms of how you execute it, in terms of how much you're going to vow, how long you're going to vow, and so forth. But, you know, like King David, he had a rowdy soul. You remember it calls him ruddy? He was red. That's like Esau. He had a rowdy soul. But a soul like that can really get on top of things. Once that soul yields to the Spirit, it's a great instrument. And I would rather hear somebody say, I'm just so tired of fighting this thing. I pray and I repent and I pray and I repent and it keeps happening. You know what? I would rather hear that than hear somebody tell me they never have any problems. I want to hear your soul is rowdy, because that means there's a lot of life in it, but it can be directed. It can be rerouted from being rowdy into doing the work of the Spirit, doing that work of consecration. But the soul has to start seeing things like, hey, I don't need to be secluded with someone of the opposite sex. The soul has to start seeing things like, you know what? This website I'm going to, they keep popping up these nasty pictures. I either need to find another website or figure out a way to get it off of there. You got to start solving your own problems where you see that something improper is happening. Because if you start secluding yourself with sin, that's where the temptation is going to enter in. So you can see now how these two things work together. You got a female example. She was warned, don't seclude yourself with this man. But then she does. And then with the Nazir, I got a rowdy soul. How can I get control of it? Well, I don't get control of it by drinking more wine. I get control of it by drinking no wine. And I discipline my soul for this set period. Because when you drink alcohol or when you take drugs, it's going to alter your logical process. And you're going to blunder. Remember, just before Joseph gets kidnapped by his brother, it said he was blundering in the field. So what did he do at Potiphar's house? He blundered into the house when most likely he knew that Potiphar's wife was the only one in there. What was he thinking about? He wasn't on the job. He thought he was at work, but he was not on the job. So you see how being a Nazir can heighten your ability to see things coming. It sharpens your vision. Alcohol will dull you. It will slow down your response. It will slow down your ability to predict consequences. I mean, how many affairs start at work because somebody started pouring out their heart to someone of the opposite sex? They were receptive, they were comforting, they were compassionate, they said all the right things, they began to be secluded, they began to stay late at work, they began texting one another, they began calling one another, they began to go on trips together, and all of a sudden the marriage is over. Why? Because they were secluded. And you've got to see the ways, not just where you might be secluded with the opposite sex, but where you might be secluding yourself with sin of any type. We have to root those things out. And that's basically the job of the Nazir. He's learning to discipline his soul so that great acts of not just deliverance, but redemption, salvation, and so forth, bearing that fruit can begin to happen. And Yeshua made a strange statement in Matthew 17:21. Remember the demoniac, there was a son who had a demon. He was falling into the fire. He was falling into the water. And the disciples couldn't cast it out. And Yeshua says, this kind doesn't go out except by prayer and fasting. And in Judaism, fasting is understood to include sexual relations. That's why Paul says you don't unilaterally decide to fast. If you're married, you come to that mutual decision. You can't just withdraw yourself because not eating may affect only you, but in terms of your sexual relationship, it affects the other person. So you have to come to that agreement. But on Yom HaKippurim, it's a day of total fasting. Everybody's going to be fasting. And on this day, the scapegoat is going to be sent Lazazel. All the sons of Israel are going to go to the wilderness on this goat. And Azazel was a demon god represented by a goat. So in this sense, you can kind of see where Yeshua's playing with the words. He's not really playing. He's hinting with the words. That these sins incited by demons, how do you get rid of them? Prayer and fasting. If you're flirting with sin, how do you get rid of it? By taking a Nazarite vow. Right? It's a discipline. And it'll require you to fast grape products. Can you still sin as a Nazarite? Absolutely. That's why you read about Samson. You can read about the ones who messed up. But in terms of helping you to understand the importance of consecrating yourself to holiness, of disciplining the soul, this is where the Nazir, if you do that work as a Nazir, then you really don't have the suspicion of the Sotah. And I guess that would be a good place to stop because I know the timer went off.